Here we're going to take a look at our file handling preferences. For the most part, these default settings, they're almost perfect. So what I want to do is just highlight a few things here and then give you a few suggestions in regards to a couple of preferences that you might want to modify. When it comes to your file saving options, these initial options here are great. Moving down to this area, you want to make sure to check this box on. Whenever you use the Save As command, which you can access from the File pull-down menu, it's really helpful to have this by default select that original folder, because typically when you're using Save As, you want to save that image in the same location. The next option you definitely want to have checked on. This is called Save in Background. What will happen in Photoshop is you'll have these files which will get really, really big. Well, it will take Photoshop a while to save those documents. If you turn this off, well, Photoshop will be frozen. You can't move forward until that file is saved. If you click this option on, it will do this saving in the background so that you can continue to work on that image or other images which you have open in Photoshop. The next option is Background Save, or automatically save recovery information. What this does is it allows you to define how frequently Photoshop is saving things behind the scenes. In other words, you might want to crank this up, say, to 5 minutes. In this way, every 5 minutes, Photoshop is going to automatically back up your image, even if you haven't saved it yourself. So why would this be helpful? Well, this would be helpful if all of a sudden Photoshop crashed. And Photoshop's a pretty stable application, but it can happen. Your computer can crash or Photoshop can crash, and you can be in the middle of a project. Well, if you are, by having this option turned on, well, it would have automatically saved that document for you, and it would have done this behind the scenes. The next time you launch Photoshop, it would then show you that recovered file. So again, this is kind of like a safety net. You want to leave that option turned on. Next, down to File Compatibility. Here there's a new button to access our camera raw preferences. You can go ahead and click on that, and it will open up those preferences. We'll be talking about those later, but I just want to highlight that this button is new in this version of Photoshop. Next, you want to leave these default settings on to prefer Adobe Camera Raw for supported RAW files, of course. Next, for this one though, I recommend you turn off. Ask before saving layered TIFF files. The TIFF file format is a really powerful file format. And if you're using other applications, say like Adobe Lightroom, like I use, well, I use that TIFF file format a lot. And I almost always have layered TIFF files. Therefore, I don't want to see this dialog every time which asks me about these TIFF files. So in my own workflow, I turn that option off. The next thing you might want to customize is this here. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. In previous versions, what we would tell people was to turn this perhaps to never. You would only use this option if you needed to save a Photoshop document and then share it with someone who is going to be using an older version of Photoshop. Well, now though, it's helpful to have this turned on, because if you use a program, say like Lightroom, well, Lightroom can't work with Photoshop documents unless the Maximize PSD file compatibility has been turned on. Therefore, you may want to choose Ask. In this way, as you save your PSD files, you can then determine to either choose that or not. Well, what is Maximize PSD compatibility? Well, what this does is if you have a layered file, it also saves inside of your document a flattened version of that layered file. When working with Lightroom, Lightroom can then access and read and work with that flattened version of the file. The downside is that it increases your file size. That's why you might want to have this option turned on, Ask, so that you're just maximizing those files that you know that you need that option turned on for. The last thing to highlight here is your recent file list. In my own workflow, I crank this up because you can access the recent files that you've worked on from your File pull-down menu. And this option won't slow down Photoshop's performance. Rather, it will help you access and open files which you've opened recently. All right, well, now that we've dialed in all of these settings, let's go ahead and click OK. And I just want to highlight the recent file list for you to show you where you can find that option. If you navigate to the File pull-down menu, here you'll see Open Recent, and it will show you all of the files which you have opened recently. In my case, I've only opened these 3 files, but because I changed that number to 20, it would remember the last 20 files that I've worked with. As I continue to open these files, this list would grow. And I find this is just a really helpful way to access and find files that I've worked on recently. Because sometimes you work on an image, then you accidentally close it. Well, you can then go to this Open Recent dialog, and reopen it really easily without having to search around or without having to navigate back to the Adobe Bridge.